Hi friends, continuing to the chapter How to Win Friends and Influence People. A sure way of making enemies and how to avoid it. When Theodore Roosevelt was in the White House, he confessed that if he could be right 75% of the time, he would reach the highest measure of his expectations. If that was the highest rating that one of the most distinguished men of the 12th century could hope to obtain, what about you and me? If you can be sure of being right only 55% of the time, you can go down to Wall Street and make $1 million a day. If you can't be sure of being right ever 55% of the time, why should you tell others people they are wrong? You can tell people they are wrong by a look or an intonations or a gesture just as eloquently as you can in the words. As if you tell them they are wrong, do you make them want to agree with you? Never, for you have struck a direct blow at their intelligence, judgment, pride, and self respect that will make them want to strike back. But it will never make them want to change their mind. You may then hurl at them all the logics of a Plato or an Immanuel Kant, but you will not alter their opinions, for you have hurt their feelings, never being by announced, I am going to prove you and so to you. That's bad. That's a tremendous to saying, I am smarter than you are. I am going to tell you the things or two and make you change your mind. This is a challenge. It arouses opposite and makes the listeners want to battle with you before you even start. It is difficult under even the most begin conditions to change people's mind. So why make it harder? Why handicap yourself? If you're going to prove anything, don't let anybody knows it. Do it so stubbornly, so adoristically that no one will feel that you are doing it. This was expressed distinctly by Alexander Pope. Men must be taught as if you taught them not, and things unknown proposed as things forgot. Or 300 years ago, Galileo said, you cannot teach a man anything, you can only help him to find him within himself. As Lord Chesterfield said to his son, be wiser than other people if you can, but do not tell them so. Socrates said repeatedly to his followers in Athens, only things only I know, and that is that I was nothing. Well, I can't hope to be any smarter than Socrates, so I have quit telling people they were wrong, and I found that it pays. If a person make a statement that you think is wrong, yes, even that you know is wrong. Isn't it better to begin by saying, well, now look, I thought otherwise, but I may be wrong. I am. And if I am wrong, I want to put right. Let's examine the fact. There is a magic, positive magic, in such phrases as I may be wrong, I am. Let's examine the fact. Nobody in the heavens above or on the earth beyond or in the water under the earth will ever object to your sayings. I may be wrong. Let's examine the fact. One of our class members who used in this approach in dealing with the customers was Harold Rakins, a dog dealer in Billings. Montana. He reported that because of the pressures of the automobile businesses, he was often hard boiled and callous when dealing with the customers' complaints. This caused flared tempers, loss of business, and general unpleasantness. He told his class that recognizing that this was getting now were fast, I tried a new tact. I would say something like this: our dealership has made so many mistakes that I am frequently ashamed. We may have erred in your cases. Tell me about it. This approach became quite disarming, and by the time the customer releases his feelings, he is usually much more responsible when it comes to settling the matter. In fact, several customers have thanked me for having such an understanding attitude, and two of them have enough brought in friendship to buy a new cars. In this highly competitive market, we need more of this type of a customer, and I believe that showing respect for all customers' opinion and treating them diplomatically and courteously will help beat the competition. You will never got into trouble by admitting that you may be wrong. That will stop all the argument and inspire your opponents to be just as an open and a broad-minded as you are. It will make him want to admit that he too may be wrong. If you know positively that a person is wrong and you bluntly tell him or her so, what happened? Let me illustrate. Mr. S., a young New York attorney, once argued a rather important case before the United States Supreme Court. The case involved a considerable sum of money and an important question of a law. During the argument, one of the Supreme Court justices said to him, "The status of the limitations in administrative law is 6 years, is it not?" Mr. S. stopped, started at the justice for a moment, and then said bluntly, "Your Honor, there is no status of limitations in admiralty." A hush fell on the court. Said Mr. S. as he related his experience to one of the other classes. And the temper in the room seems to drop zero. I was right. Justice was wrong. And I have told him so. But did that make me him friendly? No, I still believe that I have the law on my side. And I know that I spoke better than I ever spoke before. But I didn't pursue. I made the enormous blunder of telling a very learned and a famous man that he was wrong. Few peoples are logical. Most of us are prejudiced and biased. Most of us are blighted with preconceived notions, with jealousy, suspicions, fear, envy, and pride. And most citizens don't want to change their minds about their religions or their haircuts or communism or their favorite movie stars. So, if you are inclined to tell the people they were wrong, please read the following paragraph every morning before breakfast. It is from James Harvey Robinson, entitled Books, The Mind in the Making. We sometimes find ourselves changing our minds without any resistance or heavy emotions. But if we are told we are wrong, we resent the impulations and harden our hearts. We are incredibly heedlessness in the information of our beliefs, but find ourselves filled with an delicate patience for them. When anyone proposes to rob us of their companionship. It is obvious not only the ideas themselves that are dear to us, but our self esteem, which is threatened. The little word my is the most important one in human affairs, and properly to reckon within it is the beginning of wisdom. It has the same force whether it is my dinner, my dog, my house, or my father, my country, and my God. We not only resent the impulsions that our watch is wrong or our car shabby, but that our conception of the channel of mass, of the pronunciation of epithistic, of the medicline value of Salensin, or of the date of Sarogan I is subject to revision. We like to continue to believe that we have been astonished to accept as truth, and the resentment aroused when doubt is cast upon any of our assumptions lead us to seek every manners of excuses for clinging to it. The result is that most of our so called reasoning consists in finding arguments for going off believing as we already do. Carl Rogers, the eminent philosophist, wrote in his book on becoming a person, I found it of enormous value when I can permit myself to understand the other person. The way in which I have wondered this statement may seem strange to you. It is necessary to permit oneself to understand another. I think it is. Our first reaction to the most of the statement which we hear from other people is an evaluation or judgment rather than an understanding of it. When someone expresses some feelings, attitudes, or beliefs, our tendency is almost immediately to feel that is right, or that stupid, that's abnormal, that's unreasonable, that's incorrect, that is not nice. Very rarely do we permit ourselves to understand precisely what is the meaning of the statement is to the other person. I once employed an interviewed decorator to make some draperies for my home. When the bill arrived, I was dismayed. A few days later, a friend dropped in and looked at the draperies. The price was mentioned, and she explained with a note of triumph, What? That's awful. I'm afraid he put one over on you. True, yes, she had told the truth, but few people like to listen to the truth that reflects on their judgment. So, being human, I tried to defend myself. I pointed out that the best is eventually the cheapest, that one can't expect to get quality and artistic taste at bargain basement prices, and so on and on. The next, another friend dropped in, admired the draperies, bubbled over with the enthusiasm, and expressed a wish that she could afford such extensive creations for her home. My reaction was totally different. Well, to tell the truth, I said, I cannot afford them myself. I paid too much. I'm sorry, I ordered them. When we are wrong, we may admit it to yourself, and if we are handled gently and tactfully, we may admit it to others and even take pride in our fairness and broad-mindedness. But not if someone else is trying to ram the unpalatable fat down on esophagus. Horace Greeley, the most famous editor in America during the time of the Civil War, disagreed violently with Lincoln's policies. He believed that he could drive Lincoln into arguing with him by campaigning of argument, ridicule, and abuse. He wagged his bitter campaign month after month, year after year. In fact, he wrote a brutal, bitter, sarcastic, and a personal attack on President Lincoln's the night Booth shot him. But did all that bitterness makes Lincoln's agree with Greeley? Not at all. Ridiculous and abuse never do. If you want some excellent suggestions about dealing with people and managing yourself and improving your personality, read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, one of the most fascinating life stories ever written, one of the classics of the American literature. Ben Franklin tells how he conquered the inadvertent habits of argument and transformed himself into one of the most able, savage, and diplomatic men in American history. One day, when Ben Franklin was a blundering youth and an old Quaker friend took him aside and lashed him with a few stilling truths. Something like this: Ben, you are impossible. Your opinion has a slap in them for everyone who differs with you. They have become so offensive that nobody cares for them. Your friends find the way they enjoy themselves better when you are not around. You know so much that no man can tell you anything. Indeed, no man is going to try, for the effort you would lead only to discomfort and hard work. So you are not likely ever to know any more than you do now, which is very little. One of the finest things I know about Ben Franklin is the way he accepted that smartling rebuke. He was big enough and wise enough to realize that it was true, to sense that he was headed for failure and social disaster. So he made a right about face. He began immediate to the changes his innocence opinionated way. I made it a rule, said Franklin, to forbear all recent contradictions to the sentiments of others and all the positive assertions of my own. I even forbade myself the use of every word of expressions in the language that imported a fix the opinion, such as certainly, undoubtedly, etc. And I adopt instead of them, I convince, I apprehend, or I imagine a thing to be so, or it so appears to meet me at present. When another assisted some things that I thought an error, I deny myself the pleasure of contradicting him abruptly and of showing immediately some absurdity in his propositions. And in answering, I began by observing that in certain cases of circumstance, his opinion would be right, but in the present case, there would appear or seem to be me some differences, etc. I soon found the advantage of these changes in my manner. The conversation I engaged in went on more pleasantly. The modest way in which I proposed my opinion produces them a readier reception and less contradiction. I had less mortification when I found it to be in the wrong, and I more easily prevailed with others to give up their mistakes and join with me when I happened to be in the right. And this mode, which I at the first put on with some violences to natural inclination, becomes at length so easy and so habitual to me that perhaps for these 50 years past no one has ever heard a dogmatical expression escape me. And to this habit, after my character of integrity, I think it's principally owing that I had earned so much weight with my fellow citizens when I proposed new situations or alterations in the old, and so much influences in the public council when I became a member, for I was a bad speaker, never eloquent, subject to much hesitation in my voice of words, hardly correct in the language, and yet I generally carried my points. How do Ben Franklin's method work in business? Let's take two examples. Catherine, a Alred of King Mountain, North Carolina, is an industrial engineering supervisor for a yarn processing plant. She told one of her classes how she handled a sensitive problem before and after talking or training. Part of my responsibility, she reported, deals with setting ups and maintaining intensive systems and standard for our operators so they can make more money by producing more yarn. The system were using had worked fine when we had only 2 or 3 different types of yarn. But recently we had expanded our inventory and the capitables to enable us to run more than 12 different varieties. The present system was no longer adequate to pay the operators fairly for the work being performed and give them a intensive to increase production. I have worked up a new system which would enable us to pay the operator by the class of the yarn she was running at any point one particular time. With my new system in the hand, I entered the meeting determined to prove to the management that my system was the right approach. I told them in detail how they were wrong and showed where they have been being unfair and how I have all the answers they needed. To say that, at least, I failed miserably. I had become so busy defending my position on the new system that I had left them no opening to graciously admit their problems on the old one. The issue was dead. After several sessions of these courses, I realized all too well where I had made my mistakes. I called another meeting and this time I asked where they felt their problems were. We discussed each points and I asked them their opinion on which was the best way to proceed. With a few low-key suggestions at proper intervals, I let them develop my system themselves. At the beginning, at the end of the meeting, when I was actually presented my system, they enthusiastically accepted it. I am convinced now that nothing good is accomplished and a lot of damage can be done if you tell a person straight out that he or she is wrong. You only suggest in stripping that person of self dignity and making yourself an unwelcome part of any discussion. Let's take another example and remember these cases I am citing are typical of the experiences of thousands of other people. R.V. Rowles was a salesman for a lumber company in New York. Crowley admitted that he had been telling hard-boiler lumber inspector for years that they were wrong, and he had won the arguments too, but it hadn't done any good. For these lumber inspectors, said Mr. Crowley, aren't like baseball umpires. Once they make a decision, they never changed it. Mr. Crowley said that This firm was losing thousands of dollars through the arguments he won. So, while taking my courses, he resolved to change tactics and abandon arguments, which was result. Here is a story as he told it to the fellow members of his classes. One morning, the phone rang in my office. A hot and a bothered person at the other end proceeded to inform me that the car of a lumber was had shipped into his plant was entirely unsatisfactory. This firm has stopped unloading and requested that we make immediate arrangements to remove the stock from their yards. After about one fourth of the car has been unloaded, their number of inspectors reported that the number was running 55% below grade. Under the circumstances, they refused to accept it. I immediately started for his plant and on the way turned over in my mind the best way to handle the situation. Ordinarily, under such circumstances, I should have quoted grading rules and tries. As a result of my own experience and the knowledge as a lumber inspector, to convince the other inspector that the lumber was actually up to the grade and that he was minister printing that rule in his inspections. However, I thought I would apply the principles learning in his training. When I arrived at the planet, I found the purchasing agent and the lumber inspector in a wicked humor. Both set for an argument and a fight. We walked out to the car that was being unloaded, and I requested that they continue to unload so that I could see how things were going. I asked the inspector to go to right ahead and lay out the rejects, and as he had been doing, and to put the good pieces in another pile. After watching him for a while, it begins to dawn on me that his inspection actually was much too strict and that he was misinterpreting the rules. This particular lumber was white pine, and I knew this inspector was thoroughly schooled in hardwoods but not a competent, experienced inspector on a white pine. White pine happened to be my own strong suits, but did I offer my objections to the way he was grading the lumber? None whatever. I kept on watching and gradually became to ask the questions as to why certain pieces were not satisfactory. I didn't for one incident that the inspector was wrong. I empathized that my only reason for asking was in order that we would come from his firm exactly what they wanted in future shipments. By asking the questions in very friendly, cooperative spirits and insisting continuously that they were right in laying out boards not satisfactory to their purpose, I got him wound up, and the strained relations between us began to thaw and melt away. An occasional carefully put remarks on my part gave birth to the idea in this mind that possibly some of these rejected pieces were actually within the grade that they had bought, and that their requirements demanded a more expensive grade. I was very careful, however, not to tell them think I was making a issues of this point. Gradually, his whole attitude changed. He finally admitted to me that he was not experienced on white pine and began to ask me a question about each pieces as it came out of the car. I would explain why such a piece came out within the grade specified, but kept on insisting that we did not want him to take if it was unsuitable for their purpose. He finally got to the point where he felt guilty every time he put a piece in his rejected pile. And at last he saw the mistake was on the other part for not having specified as good as a trait as they needed. The ultimate outcome was that he went through the entire car loaded again after I left, accepted the world lot, and we received a check in full. In that one instance alone, a little fact and the determination to refrain from telling the other man he was wrong saved my company a substantial amount of cash, and it would be hard to place a money value on the good that will have saved. Martin Luther King was asked how, as a fascist, he could be an admirer of Air Force General Daniel Chappie James, then the National's highest ranking black officer, Dr. King, replied, I judge people by their own principles, not by my own. In a similar way, General Robert E. Lee once spoke to the presidents of the Confederation, Jefferson Davis, in the most glowing terms about a certain officer under his commands. Another officer in attendance was astonished. General, he said, do you not know that the man of whom you speak so highly is one of your bitterest enemies who misses no opportunity to amalgam you? Yes, replied General Lee, but the president asked my opinion of him. He did not ask for his opinion of me. By the way, I am not revealing anything new in this chapter. 2000 years ago, Jesus said, agree with thine advisory quickly. And 2200 years before Christ was born, King Antiochus of Egypt gave his son some sure advice that is surely needed today. Be diplomatic. Consult the king. It will help you gain your point. In other words, don't argue with your customers or your spouse or your advisories. Don't tell them that they were wrong. Don't get them striped up. Use a little diplomacy. Show respect for the other person's opinion. Never say you are wrong. If you are wrong, admit it. Within a minute walk of my house, there was a wild stretch of a virgin timber where the blackberry thickest foamed white in the springtime, where the squirrel nested and reared their eggs, and the horseweeds grew as tall as a horse's head. This unspoiled woodland was called as Forest Park, and it was a forest, probably not much different in the appearance from what it was when Columbus discovered America. I frequently walked in the park with Rex, my little Boston bulldog. He was a friendly, harmless little hound, and since we rarely met anyone in the park, I took Rex along without a leash or a muzzle. One day, we encountered a mountain policeman in the park, a policeman itching to show his authority. What do you mean by letting that dog run loose in the park without a muzzle and a leash? He reprimanded me. Don't you know it's against the law? Yes, I know it is, I replied softly, but I didn't think he would do any harm out there. You didn't think? The law doesn't give a thinner damn about what you think. The dog might kill a squirrel or bite a child. Now I am going to tell you of this time, but if I catch this dog out here again without a muzzle and leash. You will have to tell it to the judge. I meekly promise to obey. And I did obey for a few minutes, but Rex didn't like the muzzle and neither did I. So we decided to take a change. Every day we was loving for a while and then we struck a snag. Rex and I raced over the brow of hills on the afternoon, and there, suddenly to my dismay, I saw the majesty of the law as to bide a bay horse. Rex was out in the front, heading against for the officer. I was in for it. I knew it. So I didn't wait until the policeman started talking. I beat him to it. I said, "Officer, you have caught me red-handed. I'm guilty. I have no alibis, no excuses. You warned me last week that I brought the dog out here again without a muzzle, you would find me." "Well, now," the policeman responded in a soft tone, "I know it is a temptation to let the little dog like that have a run out here when nobody is around." "Sure, it's a temptation," I replied, "but it is against the law." "Well, a little dog like that isn't going to harm anybody," the policeman remonstrated. "No, but he may kill a squirrel," I said. "Well, now, I think you are taking this a bit too seriously," he told me. "I will tell you what to do. You just let him run over the hill there where I can't see him, and we will forget all about it." That policeman, being human, wanted a feeling of importance. So when I began to condemnate myself, the only way he could nourish his self-esteem was to take the magnanimous attitude of showing mercy. "But suppose I have tried to defend myself." "Well, did you ever argue with the policeman?" But instead of breaking her lunches with him, I attempted that. He was absolutely right and I was absolutely wrong. I admitted it quickly, openly, and with an enthusiasm. The affair terminated graciously in my tasking his side and his taking my side. Lord Sheffield himself would hardly have been more gracious than this mounted policeman, who only a week previously had threatened to have the laws on me. "If we know we are going to be rebuked anyhow, isn't it far better to beat the other person to it and do it ourselves? Isn't it much easier to listen to self-criticism than to bear condemnation from alien lips about yourself, all the decostory things you know the other person is thinking or want to say to you instead to say, and say them before that person has a change to say them? The changes are 100 to 1 that a generous, forgiving attitude will be taken and your mistakes will be minimized, just as the mounted police did with me and Rex. Ferdinand E. Warren, a commercial artist, used this technique to win the goodwill of a prudent, scolding buyer of art. It is important in making drawings for advertising and publishing purposes to be precise and very exact, Mr. Warren said as he told the story. Some art editors demand that their commissions be executed immediately, and in these cases, some slight error is liable to occur. I knew one art director in a particular who was always delighted to find fault with some little things. I have often left his office in disgust, not because of the criticism, but because of his method of attack. Recently, I delivered a rush job to this editor, and he phoned me to call at his office immediately. He said something was wrong. When I arrived, I found just what I have anticipated and dreaded. He was hostile, gloating over his chance to criticize. He demanded with the heat why I had done so and so. My opportunity had come to apply the self criticism I had been studying about. So I said, Mr. So and so, if what you say is true, I am at fault, and there is so absolutely no excuses for my blunder. I have been doing drawing for you long enough to know better. I am ashamed of myself. Immediately, he started to defend me. Yes, you are right, but after all, it isn't a serious mistake. It is only. I interrupted him. Any mistake? I said, may be costly. They are all irritating. He started to break in, but I wouldn't let him. I was having a grand time. For the first time in my life, I was criticizing myself, and I love it. I should have been more careful, I continued. You give me a lot of work and you deserve the best, so I am going to do this drawing all over. No, no, he protested. I wouldn't think of putting you to all that trouble. He praised my work, assured me that he wanted only a minor change and that my slight error hasn't cost his firm any money. And there, after all, it was a mere detail not worth worrying about. My eagerness to criticize myself took all the fight out of him. He ended up by taking me to the lunch, and before we parted, he gave me a check and other commission. There is a certain degrees of satisfaction in having a courage to admit one's error. It is not only clears the air of guilt and defectiveness, but often help solve the problems created by the error. Bruce Havley of Alberia, New Mexico, had incorrectly authorized payment of full wages to an employee on sick leaves. When he discovered his error, he brought it to the attention of the employee and explained that to correct the mistake, he would have reduced his next payback by the entire amount of the overpayment. The employee pleaded that as that would cause him a serious financial problem. Could the money be repaid over a period of time? In order to do this, Harvey explained he would have to obtain his superior's approval. He would have to obtain his superior approval, and this I know, reported Havley, would result in a boss type explosions. While trying to decide how to handle the situation better, I realized that the whole mess was my fault and I would have to admit it to my boss. I walked into the office, told him that I had made a mistake, and then informed them of a complete facts. He replied in an explosive manner that I was the fault of the personnel department. I repeated that it was my fault. He exploded again about carelessness in the accounting department. Again, I explained it was my fault. He blamed two other peoples in the office, but each time I reattained it was my fault. Finally, he looked at me and said, okay, it was your fault. Now, straightening it out, the error was corrected and nobody got into trouble. I felt great because I was able to handle a tense situation and had the courage not to seek alibis. My boss has more respect for me ever since. Any fool can try to defend his or her mistakes, and most fools do. But it raised on above the hurt and gives on a feelings of nobility and exclusion to admit one's mistakes. For example, one of the most beautiful things that the history records about Robert E. Lee is the way he blamed himself and only himself for the failure of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Pickett's charge was undoubtedly the most brilliant and picturesque attacks that ever occurred in the Western world. General George A. Pickett himself was picturesque. He wrote his hair so long that his unburned locks almost touched his shoulders. Unlike Napoleon in his Italian campaigns, he wrote ardent love letters almost daily while in the battlefield. He devoted troops cheered him the tragic July afternoon as he rode off jauntily towards the Union lines. His cap set at a rakish angle over his right ear. They cheered and they followed him, man touching man, rank pressing rank, with banners flying and bayonets gleaming in the sun. It was a gallant sight, daring, magnificent. A murmur of admiration ran through the Union lines as they beheld it. Pickett's troops swept forward at any ease, trot through orchard and cornfield, across a meadows and over a ravine. All the time the enemy's cannon was tearing gashy holes in their ranks, but on they pressed grimms irresistible. Suddenly the Union infantry rose from behind the stone wall on the cemetery rides where they had been hiding and fired volley after volley into Pickett's on rushing troops. The crest of the hill was a sheet of flame, a Gloucester house, a blazing volcano. In a few minutes, all of Pickett's brigade commanders except one were down, and the 4/5 of his 5,000 men had fallen. General Lewis, Armistead, leading the troops in the final plunge, ran forward, vaulting over the stone wall and waving his cap on the top of his sword, shouted, "Give 'em the steel, boys!" They did. They leaped over the wall, batonned their enemies' smacked skull with clubbed muskets, and planted the battle flags of the south of Cemetery Ridge. The banners waved there only for a moment, but that moment, brief as it was, recorded the high watermarks of confidentiary. Pickett's charge, brilliant, heroic, was nevertheless the beginning of the end. Lee has failed. He could not penetrate the North, and he knew it. The South was doomed. Lee was so saddened, so shocked, that he sent in his resignations and asked Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, to appoint a younger and a abler man. If Lee had wanted to blame the disaster failure of Pickett's charge on someone else, he would have found a score of alibis. Some of his division's commanders has failed him. The cavalry haven't arrived in the time to support the infantry attack. This has gone wrong and that has gone away. But Lee was far too noble to blame others. As Pickett's beaten and bloody troops struggled back to the Confederate line, Robert E. Lee rode out to meet them all alone and greeted them with a self-condemnation that was little short of sublime. "All this have been my fault," he confessed. "I and I alone have lost this battle." Few generals in all history have had the courage and the characters to admit that. Michael Chuang, who teaches our course in Hong Kong, told of how the Chinese culture presents some special problems and how sometimes it is necessary to recognize that the benefit of applying a principle may be more advantageous than maintaining an old tradition. He had one middle aged class member who had been estranged from his son for many years. The father had been a opium addict but was no cured. In Chinese tradition, an older person cannot take the first step. The father felt that it was up to his son to take the initiatives towards a reconciliation. In an early sessions, he told the class about the grandchildren he had never seen and how much he desired to be reunited with his son. His classmates, all Chinese, understood his conflict between his desire and long established traditions. The father felt that the young people should have respect for their elders and that he was right. I am not giving it into his desire, but to wait for this son to come to him. Towards the end of the course, the father again addressed his class. I have pondered his problem, he said. Dali Carnine says, if you are wrong, admit it quickly and empathically. It is too late for me to admit it quickly, but I can admit it empathetically. I wronged my son. He was right in not wanting to see me and to exile me from his life. I may lose face by asking a younger person's forgiveness, but I was at fault and it is my responsibility to admit this. The class applauded and gave him their full support. At the next class, he told how he went to his son's house and asked and received forgiveness and was now embarked on a new relationship with his son, his daughter-in-law and the grandchildren he had last met. Albert Herberg was one of the most original authors who ever stripped up a nation, and his stinging sentences often aroused fierce resentments. But Hubert, with his rare skills for handling people, frequently turned his enemies into friends. For example, when some irritates and readers wrote in to say that he didn't agree with such and such an article and ended by calling Hamburgs this and that, Albert Hamburgs would answer like this. Come to think it over, I don't entire agree with it myself. Not everything I wrote yesterday appeals to me today. I am glad to learn what you think on the subject. The next time you are in the neighborhood, you must visit us, and we will get this subject thrilled out of all the times. So, here is a hand's clap over the miles, and I am yours sincerely. What could you say to a man who treated you like that? When you are right, let's try to win people gently and tactfully to our way of thinking. And when we are wrong, and that will be surprisingly often. If we are honest with ourselves, let's admit our mistake quickly and with enthusiasm. Not only with that techniques produce astonishing results, but believe it or not, it is more fun under the circumstances than trying to defend ourselves. Remember the old proverb, by fighting you never get enough, but by yielding you get more than you expect. If you are wrong, admit it quickly and empathically. A drop of honey. If your temper is aroused and you will tell I am a thing or two, you will have a fine time unloading your feelings. But what about the other person? Will he share your pleasure? Will your brilliant tones, your hostile attitudes make it easy for him to agree with you? If you come at me with your fist doubled, said Woodrow Wilson, I think I can promise you that mine will doubt as fast as yours. But if you come to me and say, let us sit down and take counsels together, and if we differ from each other, understand why is it that we differ. Just what the point at issues are. We will presently find that what the point at issues are. We presently find that we are not so far apart after all, that the points on which we differ are few and the points on which we agree are many, and that if we only have the patience and the candors and the desires to get together, we will get together. Nobody appreciated the truth of Woodrow Wilson's statements more than John D. Rockefeller. Dr. Junior back in 1915, Rockefeller was the most fiercely despised man in Colorado. One of the bloodiest strikes in the history of American history has been shocking the state for 2 terrible years. Irati, belligerent miners were demanding higher wages from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. Rockefeller controlled that company. Property has been destroyed. Troops has been cancelled out. Bloods had been shed. Strikes had been shot. The body riddled with bullets. At a time like that, with the air sheathing with hatred, Rockefeller wanted to win the strikers to his way of thinking. And he did it. How? Here's the story. After a week spent in making friends, Rockefeller addressed the representative of the strikers. This speech isn't entirely in a masterpiece. It produces astonishing results. It calmed the tempestuous wave of hate that threatened to engulf Rockefeller. It won him a host of admirers. It presented fact in such a friendly manner that the strikers went back to the work without saying any other word about the increase in the wages for which they have fought so violently. The opening of that remarkable speech follows. Note how it fairly glows with friend lines. Rockefeller's remember was talking to a man who was a few days previously had wanted to hang him by the neck to a sour apple tree. Yet he couldn't have been more gracious, more friendly, if he had addressed a group of medical missionaries. His speech was radiant with such a phrases as I am proud to be here, having visited in your homes, met many of your wives and children. We meet here not as a stranger but as a friends. A spirit of a mutual friendship or common interest, it is only by the courtesy that I am here. This is a red day in my life. Rockefeller began, it is the first time I have ever had the good fortune to meet the representative of the employees of this great company, its officer and the superintendents together, and I can assure you that I am proud to be here and that I shall remember this gathering as long as I live. Had this meeting been held 2 weeks ago, I should have stood here a stranger to most of you. Recognizing a few faces, having had the opportunity last week of visiting all the camps in the southern coast field and talking individually with particularly all of the representatives except those who were away. Having visited in your homes, met many of your wives and the children, we meet here not as a stranger but as a friends. And it is in the spirit of mutual friendship that I am glad to have this opportunity to discuss with you your common interest. Since this is a meeting of the officers of the company and the representative of the employees, it is only by your courtesy that I am here, for I am not a fortune as to be either one or the other, and yet I feel that I am intimately associated with you men. For instance, I represent both the stockholders and the directors. Isn't that a superb example of fine art of making friendship out of enemies? Suppose Rockefeller had taken a difficult task. Suppose he has argued with those inner miners and the hurdled deviating factors in their phrases. Suppose he has told them by his tones and intimations that they have were wrong. Suppose that by all the rules of the logic he had proved that they were wrong. What would have happened? More anger would have been stirred up, more hatred, more revolt. If a man's heart is rankling with discord and it is feeling towards you, you can't win him or your way of thinking with all the logics in the Christaben. Scolding parents and dominating bosses and the husbands and the nagging wives ought to realize that the people don't want to change their minds. They cannot be forced or driven to agree with you or me, but there may be possibly be lead to if we are gentle and friendly, ever so gentle and ever so friendly. Thank you.